Last week I had lunch with a person that's been attending our church just to talk to them a little bit about the church, and they asked me who that one young lady that sings in the team once in a while is that always smiles and seems to enjoy herself. I never could come up with anybody. Anybody guess who he might have been thinking about? Oh, really? Ed was right. Man, I'm glad you were here to tell me that. Megan, your fan club is over here on this side. Thank you, Megan, and thank you, congregation, for loving and supporting her all these years. In the near future, we might even begin our worship service. If you can imagine this, a worship leader gets up and they ask you to, if you have not already, but that you will pick up a set of earphones, sort of earphones. It's a kind of electronic headband, if you would, and you will attach it to your head. The leader might then tell the worshipers to take a deep breath, as we did in the moment ago, and give their cares to God. Why the headband, you ask? Well, it is there to help the worshipers clear their minds and find out just in fact what they can do. It sounds very sci-fi, but in fact it is alive and well. It's called a Muse, and you see it there. And you also see that it has an app on the phone that monitors the different levels with which you are, quote, emptying yourself of worries. There's the calm phase, there's the active phase, and then there's the neutral phase. I could be rude and say something like, some of you live in neutral phase all of your lives, but I won't do that. But there's all of us that live at certain levels. And so when we talk about prayer today, I want us to connect to the things that are most easily connectable, and that is prayer and worry. Because those two things, I really began this week with the whole theme of prayer, but the more I dug deeper, the more I understood what it was to pray. Even again, obviously I've read a few books about this, I've studied a little bit about it, but as I analyzed it yet again, I saw just how connected it is to our mind and our heart's ability to empty itself of worry. Now, I know I've got everybody in the room, because there's not anybody in this room who does not deal with the reality of worry. And so over the next few moments, let's try to find a way in which we can connect with prayer and, in fact, allow it to relieve some of our anxiety. I found a quote from Jodi Picoult in her novel, Sing You Home. She says, "Anxiety is like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it never gets you very far." And that's exactly the way it is. So if you got your folder, want to follow along, point number one, prayer is hard for some. Matter of fact, I thought about that, and I almost thought about adding for everyone, because there is at some level that almost all of us deal with this issue of prayer, and it is never super easy. Although I will admit there are some people who it comes almost second nature. Paul wrote, "Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, make your requests be made known to God." Private prayer. I remember vividly as a non-Christian. I didn't know what I was at the time. I just knew that I had not found any strong connection to God through the local church. I knew that I prayed, and I prayed kind of neutrally about things, but I had not yet connected it to a value system in Jesus as my Lord. And so my prayers shifted from just empty kind of fill in the blanks to, God, I need you. I need you for every experience of life, and what am I going to do to make that possible? I think through the years, as I've studied prayer and read books by George Buttrick and Bill Hybels and different people that are obviously from different ends of the spectrum, they have all come to the belief that it is, in fact, difficult for most of us. And if you need somebody to line yourself up with, that is, I would say, is the giant of the 20th century in terms of his faith experience, well, it would be a guy by the name of C.S. Lewis. In his autobiography, he talks about his struggle with prayer. Matter of fact, early in his life, when he was thinking about dealing with prayer, because he really had a renewal later in his life, because he couldn't settle that issue, it caused him to push himself backwards from his faith. In fact, he said that the technique that he had been using rendered his private prayers quite intolerable burden. So let me give you just a couple excerpts from his autobiography. He says, I've been told as a child that one must not only say one's prayers, but think about what one was saying. Accordingly, I tried to put this into practice. He says, at first it seemed plain sailing, but soon the false conscience came into play. I had no longer reached amen, then it whispered, yes, but are you sure you were really thinking about what you just said? And then more subtly he said, were you, for example, thinking about it as well as you did last night? And the answer, he says, for many reasons I did not then understand, was nearly always no. Very well, said the voice. Hadn't you then been better not to try it at all? If I obeyed, but of course there was no assurance that the second attempt would be any better than the first. He says, to these nagging suggestions, my reaction was the most foolish could have ever adopted. He said, I set upon myself a standard. No clause of my prayer was to be allowed to pass muster unless it was accompanied by what I called a realization, by which I meant a certain vividness of imagination and affection. My nightly task was to produce by sheer willpower a phenomenon which power could never produce, which was so ill-defined that I could never say with absolute confidence whether it ever occurred, and which, even if it did occur, was very mediocre spiritual value. What's he saying? He's saying that he had set himself up for failure, that he had made his prayers so high and lifted, and he had thought that there was supposed to be some kind of crackling from heaven. He had set himself up for failure in his prayers because he had put it into a very small box. Many of us, I believe, have pushed ourselves away from believing in, living out, and daily being connected to prayer because we just can't see a personal connection. So is the solution to skip praying and conclude that we then are all second-class Christians? I think not. Point 2, pitfalls are possible, not only possible, but they are in fact likely. You see, Jesus knew that. The disciples came to him and they were troubled about this whole thing of praying. So I suspect they had overheard him praying, and they knew that he had a different feel to his prayers than perhaps they had. He certainly had an intimacy that they longed for, and so they came to him and they said, teach us to pray, Luke 11. And there is where the Lord's Prayer came into being. And so we have to conclude that the public prayers that they had heard had not yet been translating easily into their own experience. So we might draw some encouragement from the fact that even they struggled. But I also want to make sure you understand that there is those of us, among us even, who do not suffer with this malady that we all kind of suffer with in terms of struggling with prayer. There are some of you who literally have the gift of prayer. I know people in this congregation who have a prayer language. I know people who regularly ask me what I want prayed for. And I just believe, I've always had folks in and around me that I believe when I ask them to pray, they have this kind of connection with God. And honestly, it is a gift. It's in the gifts, In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul talks about the different gifts of prophecy, serving, teaching, preaching, giving, acts of mercy, discernment, and yes, different measures of even prayer. So, true story of a lady who always wanted to be front and center in her church. She loved the idea of being a part of her church, and so she always signed up for whatever was needed. And what was needed at that particular time was somebody to lead the missions committee. So she led the missions committee, but it never seemed to go anywhere. It never seemed it never seemed to take off. And so she ran finally into the opportunity to take one of those surveys, those gift surveys. If you've never taken one, you ought to, because they really can nail your particular gifts. And nowhere in any of her top 3 gifts was the gift of administration. And if you're trying to lead a team and you do not have the gift of administration in your gift mix, then quit as quickly as you can. You have to have some level of administration. But what was her number one gift? Her number one gift was prayer, intercession. And man, she latched onto that. And she led others around her into a prayer chain kind of thing, into a prayer movement. And I would just simply say to you, if that is your gift, do not let it be dormant. Utilize it. Point 3, some positive practices. I do not want you to hear another sermon on prayer without having some practical pointers, in fact, to apply to your life. And one of these is kind of a very fresh one for me, even in all this. Let's look at those together. Number 1, positive practices. Sometimes we need something to warm our spirits. If I just jump into prayer sometime, I'm just bringing all of my stuff with me. I'm just bringing all of my baggage with me. But if I listen to music, and particularly if I open Scripture, if I do a devotional, if I just begin to breathe in spiritual stuff, prayer comes a whole lot easier. Matter of fact, I would encourage you never to pray right after you've driven in traffic. That's just not a most positive time to pray, at least in my life. Just do not do that. Do not attach yourself to that moment. But all of us, we need a kind of, if you would, to use the oven analogy, a preheating. We need a kind of opportunity for us to clear our minds and to get ourselves ready. Number 2 is using written prayers can open our prayer channels. Using written prayers can open our prayer channels. How many of you either grew up Roman Catholic or Episcopalian? Either one of those, okay? If you grew up into either one of those, then you grew up typically with the Book of Common Prayer or something else around that always had prayers, written prayers. You could turn over to, you could look in the index, you could find a topic, and you could run to that and pray. And I will tell you, sometimes leaning over into there, I look at written prayers often. When I write our benedictions, those are things that I've looked at and maybe reshaped for us, and I'll hang with it until I feel like we've kind of gotten it in our minds. But there's something about written prayers that, in fact, can help you. So if you need something to warm up your spirit, go to written prayers. You can pop anything up on the internet now. I looked last night and it said 365 written prayers for every occasion. Number 3, it can be helpful to write our prayers, or at least to summarize our thoughts. Rick Warren, not surprisingly, has a big practice that he uses. If you want to know how he does it, he takes a sheet of paper and divides it, and I'll share that with you if you would like to hear what he does. But what I want you to know is that even if you don't write a lot, I would encourage you to write your prayers. Write 1 or 2 down. There's something powerful about writing it down. We list them in our worship, our member guide every week. We go over those on Wednesday night. We pray over those every Wednesday night. And many of you use that for your prayer guide. It is something that guides you, and it is written. But it also reminds us as we go through and we look back at our list that God has in fact been doing some things. Walked into a room I do not often get to walk into. A young lady who's been on our prayer list, you've seen her. She's not been at this church yet. I hope she will be here at some point. She was a member of my youth group when I was youth minister at First Baptist Newport. Leslie's gone through some deep water in her life, and she's come back home. She came back home to Northern Kentucky recently. I did her father's funeral, and she's now, I believe she's still living in his house. And so she's settled in, but she had discovered that she has cancer. And they did radiation, and they did all the things that they were supposed to do, and then she went in for surgery this week. It had been a planned surgery for quite some time. And how often do you get to see your oncologist surgeon, your surgeon who deals mainly with tumors, walks in the room with a smile on his face about this big? How often have you seen that happen? He walks in and he says, there is no tumor. He says there's a scar where there was a tumor. But evidently, they so pinpointed the radiation, God was able to heal her. And the smile on her face was unforgettable. Journaling can be a powerful habit, and I would encourage you to write your prayers down. Number 4, we can benefit from an ongoing devotional process. Now, what do I mean by that? Any kind of routine that ultimately helps you will, in fact, help you more every day. Last night I was watching one of the ball games, and I saw a young man get hit around his neck area, not once but twice in one particular play. And having had a pinched nerve in my own life, I know I looked at that experience and I said, he'll never get up again. He will never move his neck again. Why? Because I was looking through my experience, and if I had been there and gotten hit like that, I would never move again, I can assure you. He goes on the sidelines, moves his neck around, he's ready to go back in. Now why? Because he had been doing a routine of regular exercise that allowed him to be able to be in a situation where that kind of thing, he was ready for that kind of thing. When you and I place ourselves in the regular habit of praying, something incredible begins to happen. And so when Paul gets to the end of that little passage that I read to you, when he gets to that and says, finally, brothers and sisters, I remember Neva's mother saying these, whatever's true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable, excellent and praiseworthy, think about such things. You know the story, garbage in, what comes out? Beautiful melodies? No. Garbage in, garbage out. Nelson Price has a book entitled How to Find Out Who You Are. And in there he had interviewed, this particular study had interviewed 15 professors, college professors I think it was, prominent college professors, and they asked them about if all the books on the art of moving human beings into action, they said, were condensed into one brief sentence, what would that statement be? And so this is what they came up with. The results were these. What the mind attends to, it considers. What the mind does not attend to, it dismisses. What the mind attends to continually, it believes. And get this one. And what the mind believes, it eventually does. How important is the mind, is your mind, in praying and letting God lead you to belief that ultimately is action? Positive practice number 5, praying for whatever our mind wanders to is a way to battle wandering. Now, this is new for me. Think about this for a minute. I always kind of said, I'm not going to let my mind wander. I'm going to position myself, get myself, I used to practice or pray regularly on kneeler because that would keep my mind focused. What this writer has said is that just embrace the wandering, because God may be using your mind to lead you to something that you need to pray about. Now, that doesn't mean you stay just on that topic, but let the Lord lead you wherever your mind might go, and let God take those thoughts and do something good with them. I'd never thought about that. And so finally, different models. How many of you have grown up with models that, you cross your hands, you lower your head, you pray at mealtime, and you have certain times that you pray, but other than that, there is no real connectedness to your prayer life? How about pushing those aside a bit and just breathing a prayer, a kind of ongoing consciousness, if you would, a stream of consciousness that wherever your mind takes you, let your mind be leading you to mention God, to ask God, to move, God to move. And so whatever wondering your mind does, you let God in on that. Wouldn't it be nice if people thought we talked to ourselves when ultimately we were talking to God? Lord, just lead me here. Just kind of breathing in a stream of consciousness. A phrase that I came up with, and God gives me these once in a while, and it says this: prayer does not help us resolve our problems, but rather prayer helps us dissolve them. Now, what does I mean by that? I struggle with prayer when I try to figure everything out. And my encouragement to you about having a different model for your prayer is don't use the model where 2 + 2 = 4. If I pray about this, I will get through it. But I'm not going to just try to understand it. I want God to dissolve it. In other words, to take it from my mind, ease me from my anxiety and my worries, and get me to where I need to be. The psychologist stands in front of a class teaching them on stress management. And everybody in the class thinks they know where that person is going when they lift up a glass. They think they're immediately going to go to is the glass half empty or half full? But no, the psychologist says this: ask how much the glass with the water in it weighs. And they all gave all kinds of guesses, from 8 ounces to 20 ounces and whatever. But she replied, honestly, the weight doesn't matter. What matters is how long I hold the glass. Think about it. If I hold it for a minute, it's no big deal. If I hold it for an hour, well, we got a problem. How about if I hold it for a day or two? Well, your arm is paralyzed and numb. In each case, the weight of the glass doesn't change, but the longer I hold it, the more it bothers me, the heavier it becomes. What's that childhood song, Let It Go? If you simply say that phrase in our house, we have 2 grandchildren that dance around and start saying, let it go. And to see Holden in his famous man stance doing let it go is just about more than you can handle. I'll let him show you someday, as opposed to letting me try to mimic that for you. But I wish all of us could have a stance or a phrase or something we could do that in the presence of God we could say, Lord, I'm going to let it go. Paul said, and the peace of God will guard. It means it will stand guard. And it will surpass all the rational things you can think about, all comprehension. It shall guard your heart in your mind. Not because you've trained it, although you certainly have tried to kind of habitually lean yourself into God's presence. Not because you've trained it, but because God, in fact, has guarded your life through Christ. Now, of all the new things I could teach you about prayer, the old thing is the one that has the best. It has the best punch and the best reason and the best power, because Christ can guard your heart. What does God need to guard your heart of today?